in today's shipping, anybody who shoots at a ship is shooting at the world. The situation continues. The spare capacity has been eaten up and all routes are affected, not only the ones going through Suez, unfortunately.
This is Beyond the Box, integrated logistics from the inside out.
Hello and welcome to Beyond the Box. I'm Ellen Hoffman.
And I'm Philip Lewin.
Phil, this is going to be deja vu for some of our listeners. We spoke about the Red Sea in episode 8, I think that was in February. We did not think that we would be here months later, back on the same topic.
No, unfortunately, and no one did, to be fair. At the start of this podcast, you heard the voice of Jan Hoffman. That's not a relation, I assume.
It's not, but I wouldn't mind having a Red Sea expert in the family these days.
Same here. So Jan Hoffman is the head of trade logistics at UNCTAD, which is the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. He says the situation is continuing.
Yeah, not only does it continue, but it's taken some interesting twists and turns, which of course we'll talk about today. And then hopefully our listeners can get a better understanding of the Red Sea situation and its impact on supply chains, which has been, at this stage, global.
Right. So let's get up to speed. Here's Mark Zacconi, the executive editor of the Journal of Commerce.
This first 6 months of the year has obviously been interesting. It actually started kind of on Christmas. I remember writing up some of the Houthi rebel initial attacks, and the initial impact was huge. It was something that we had never seen before. And, a tragic element and huge impact on the seafarers plying those waters. But in terms of a commercial impact, it was interesting because it was limited. And that was largely because, as you know, the demand was weaker. We were coming off a holiday season. There was some restocking, but inventories were still pretty okay. So we really didn't feel much of that so-called bullwhip. There was plenty of capacity. Carriers sped up ships, coordinated marine terminals and ports in Europe. So we didn't really see any of the bunching that sometimes you see when there's kind of a buildup or a disconnection of demand and capacity.
So initially, really, just a blip on the radar.
Yeah, I am not worried at all. Yes.
Of course, the story doesn't end there. Here's Mark Zacconi again.
And then an interesting thing happened. The market seemed to really turn. And it wasn't really clear right away because the demand wasn't there on the Asia, Europe, or Trans-Pacific. I mean, it was there in the sense that it was modestly growing. But we're not talking anything like pandemic surges or anything really, kind of more like building to pre-2019 levels. So that wasn't really clear, but then it became more obvious that all that capacity soaked up through the longer transits to avoid the Red Sea around Africa. And maybe even more importantly, all the extra containers that are in play to make up for those longer routings. Basically, the system was nearly maxed out. So you add a little bit of an uptick in demand, some fog and some poor weather in northern Asia, which is kind of artificially tying up capacity with some ship bunching. You see some rushes of demand, not only on the Asia, Europe, and the Transpac, but also, say, from Asia into South America. And then, of course, everything's still ginning up in terms of Asia into Mexico. There's been huge movement like that in 2 years. So, I hate to use the cliche perfect storm, but all of that kind of comes together and strains the system. And then on top of that, I think there's a sense of almost, some container executives have described it as panic. I think that might be a little bit too hard, but there's definitely, let's call it heightened apprehension about inventories over the next couple months. And as shippers are seeing some of the disruption also coming after the pandemic and all the disruption there's a sense that there's front loading going on.
So I don't like the perfect storm cliche either, but I don't really know how else to describe what we've seen.
Right. And we've gone from longer cargo journeys to significant delays, bottleneck at ports, and we see a lot of strains on our supply chain capacity.
Yeah. And we went from cargo going through the Suez Canal being affected to these worldwide impacts. Jan Hoffman from UNCTAD has some insights into why that's happening.
So the latest data is that the average distance traveled for a container today is 9% longer than in 2022. 9% longer means for the sea time, you need 9% more ships, unless you also increase the speed, which then leads to more emissions and other problems and other cost increases. So during COVID, we had also an impact on capacity. It was mostly in the ports. So ships spent 20% longer in port, which ate up the capacity and in the end led to the higher freight rates. Today, it is not the additional time in ports, but it's the additional time at sea that eats up the available capacity. And although there have been more deliveries, there has been this additional demand. And so this initial difference that I thought could make us a bit more relaxed has evaporated.
So basically, the ripple effects have been massive, and a lot of analysts are saying that this isn't over yet.
So what does that mean if you're a business shipping your goods across the ocean? That's something that Rohit Gupta knows a lot about. As global head of Transported by Maersk Solutions, businesses like these are his customers.
The customers are definitely seeing that the time is much longer than what it used to be. The capacity is limited because we are taking a longer route. It takes time for the vessels to go and come back, which means there's limited capacity available. That also means it takes time to load containers now because the vessels are taking much longer. And last but not least, we are also seeing in pockets there is port congestion because the schedules have changed. And that means that some ports have actually suffered congestion, which is also something we saw during pandemic. Supply chains have become uncertain as compared to what they were in a very normal era. The way we are shipping, the time it takes for us to ship is longer. And then the vessels are also full, which means that there is uncertainty in when the cargo gets loaded. So that definitely means that there is high level of uncertainty. But then there is an additional way of looking at it, which is the costs have also increased significantly over the last 6 months. So if you see where we were in December to where we are today, the costs have significantly increased for our customers.
There's no doubt that this has taken a toll on businesses all around the world.
And global trade across the board. Jan Hoffmann has been looking at that really closely, and he can give us a sense of what might happen down the line.
The initial direct impact is not that big because the demand is very inelastic. That means you really need your iPhone for Christmas. You really need this or that spare part. You really need the fuel for your car. And whether the transport costs go up or not, it doesn't really change the volume. So that's why we say the demand curve is very steep, it's very inelastic, and the global trade volumes, it's really difficult to see how they would go down, at least in the short term. No? There are, however, some goods that are more affected than others. And we had done some assessments during COVID when we had a somewhat similar situation, but there too we had this surge in freight rates resulting from an effective reduction of supply capacity. So freight rates went up and could show which products are most affected. One group of products that are affected are really low value goods. Imagine a container full of white plastic garden furniture, which is really cheap. And it may be made in Asia going to Europe, and the content of the container is worth, $20,000. So if there the freight rate goes up from 5 to 15,000, it starts having an impact. The interesting impact we found more medium longer term is on what we call the deep supply chains. So when you have an input into an input into an input, and the impact accumulates. So even if the value of the content of a container, say you buy some high value cameras or medical equipment or high value computer stuff. So the container is worth, $1 million. And you say, well, the freight rate is 5,000, 20,000 doesn't make a difference. Well, yes, it does, because you can have up to 9 times deep supply chains, meaning the little plastic bit that goes into a chip, that goes into a component, that goes into some gadget, that goes into the car or the camera. So all the delays, the inventory holding costs, and the higher freight rates, they accumulate. So we actually estimated that the biggest impact on prices is for some high-valued goods, where the impact is not the one-off higher freight rate, but the accumulated impact of very deep supply chains.
If ever proof of the complexity of supply chains were needed, well, you had it there.
No, and indeed. And of course, one huge question remains for everyone, and that's how long this will last. And the truth is, nobody can really say for sure.
The delays, the capacity challenges, they're expected to remain for the time being. And like you said, no one really knows when the Red Sea situation will improve, or even how long it will take us to go back to quote-unquote normal.
No, that's right. And boosting supply chain resilience, of course, always helps, both with what's going on right now and especially for the future even more. And if you listen back to episode 8 of Beyond the Box, you'll hear some ideas on how businesses can better protect their supply chains.
Yes, that's right. And that is it for this episode of Beyond the Box. A big thank you to the team behind the scenes. That's Cecilia Larson, Morten Butler, Domino Koopmanschap, and Dana Shakar A.
And as a reminder, you can always find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Goodbye for now.